and second, illegal arms, because that was the real problem, in a sense that it is due to that, all those people who were doing some criminal acts were able to assert their illegal power or their illegitimate power before the people, or just to kind of uh, uh, you know uh, keeping the people in a permanent condition of fear, right? So that's what was the reason in his understanding. But all these two things combined would not have been in a position to bring about the desired results in Abhayanand's understanding, unless mid-course correction would not happen. Meaning that there has to have a continuous monitoring of the activities which would be undertaken or which would be done by the people on the ground. So that is where he would be in constant touch with the superintendents of police in different districts, and wherein he would advise on different courses of action, as well as on the legal implications of their actions, right? So that is where this would be this would be a kind of act which would make possible mid course correction with respect to the actions of the police personnel. So eventually it was seen that within 3 years, not only law and order improved, but significant achievements were made on the development of infrastructure front. Schools, they turned to little better conditions, and the activities were close to normal. The students, they returned to the schools, so the attendance in the schools, they were much better compared to the earlier years. So the point I'm trying to make, that what actually it involved in terms of study by a policy analyst, that where to look for the factors, or where to look for the actual data or information, when as policy analyst he wants to understand the law and order policy of the then government in Bihar, right? So let me stop here, and uh, then come back to the theoretical understanding of the things, that how the study of specific policies or actions of government can be done in the light of the theoretical developments which have taken place in the field of policy studies. Now, if you look at the various approaches which have been taken by various scholars, or which have been taken by various policy analysts, or academicians, right? So, different academicians or scholars, they would try to locate the problem at various levels. They will try to look at the factors which in their understanding would be the most important factor in terms of analyzing or understanding a particular policy. So that is where that is where you will find that some policy analysts, they would focus on the nature of the regime, for instance, right? Meaning that every state would be run according to certain policies, but different political regimes would adopt policies which would be different given their nature. Meaning that democratic regimes, they would adopt a policy which would be people oriented. Meaning that if one can elaborate a bit, democratic governments, they cannot afford to overlook or ignore the demands of the people when they are devising or implementing a policy, right? Against this, when one is looking at a slightly authoritarian regime, for instance, or a dictatorship, for instance, right? So the government there too would have policies, but their policies would their policies would not look at the demands of the people, or their policies would not factor in the sentiments of the population, right? So as far as the policies made by such regimes are concerned, they would be concerned more with the protection of their own power, and how actually power would be exercised, or rather successfully exercised, rather than what actually people require, right? So that is where there would be a kind of distinct approach with respect to two different regimes, when one is trying to associate the kind of policies that will be implemented in the regimes which may be democratic or which may be authoritarian, right? So that is where policy analysts would try to understand the policies, their overall objective, their overall processes, and their overall their overall nature, given the fact that under what regime, or in what kind of regime, they are either formulated or implemented. So that would be one way to understand the policy, right? The second approach that would be taken, was this, हाँ 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 बताइए. हम्म 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 Okay, okay, okay. No, I understood. I understood. What you are asking, right? See, there are two things, right? There are two things that we have to understand when we are trying to look at the whole process of policy formulation and implementation, in democratic regimes. Now, let me add that it is not that simple. It is just to explain you the broad understanding with respect to the approaches, or with respect to the methods that people have taken in order to understand policies in different regimes. So regime type could be an indication of the nature of policy. Then that is just one way to understand. The point I was trying to highlight, that in democratic regimes, the governments are expected to, right, not necessarily that every demand of the government, or sorry, every demand of the people would be met with. Why this would not be a policy, this would not be a possibility. I would come to this issue at a slightly little later stage. But the point I was trying to highlight, that if you see in a comparative manner, or if you compare the types of regime, then democratic regimes are more likely to give space to the demands and sentiments of the people, compared to the authoritarian regime, or a dictatorship, right? So it is in that respect that I was trying to highlight the issue of demands of the people finding place in the policy formulation or implementation acts of the government, right? But I may add that there are a lot of other issues involved, wherein the nature of politics, how politics actually takes place, right? Whether policies determine politics, or politics determines policies, all these things, they come into play when you are trying to understand where the nature and meaning of policy, right? So that thing we have to keep in mind, right? So when we are referring to the demands of the people, which would be considered to be a significant problem by the government, on which policies would be required. So that also involves process and a lot of deliberation and cost benefit analysis on the part of the government, meaning that that is not the only factor, right? But that may be one of the factors which the government cannot ignore in democratic regimes. right? So cannot ignore or cannot overlook. This is the point, I was trying to make, right? Is that clear? Now, many of the things, that would become clear when we discuss this issue at a later stage, right? Is that clear? So there are many reasons that why government would not disclose the data, or whether there is some objective behind not disclosing the data, or there is a simply larger political objective which governs the government's action in terms of not disclosing the data. That we will come to at later stage, because all these things would come when we are trying to understand different models, when we are trying to understand different methods which are taken by the scholars and academicians in terms of understanding the policy, right? Now coming back, that is one, right? Second, many of the policy analysts, they have tried to look at the causal factors, meaning that as far as the policies are concerned, policies, they are made by the government, they are implemented, and they find in their place in societies, primarily because they have been given effect to by some causes which exist, meaning that policies do not come out of nothing, right? So there are some causes, and based on those causes, a particular policy or nature of a particular policy can be understood and analyzed.